Thank you, Mike. Before I present the history of Millburn Street, I'd like to give you a little background on how the study came about. My wife and I bought the two-storey cottage in October 2018. It was in a fairly poor state and in need of some quite considerable upgrading, damp-proofing and modernisation. I have a background in the construction industry, so the majority of the work on the house was carried out by me with the help from my wife, particularly with the paintbrush. This work started in earnest in November 2018 and initially involved a lot of stripping out of old fittings, plumbing, stud walls to reveal the main structure hidden behind it. It was at this time that we noticed a few older features, including roof flashing chase marks on the first floor on the north gable wall, indicating that the cottage had at one time been a single-storey property. We also found an old brick fireplace and chimney which appeared older than the rest of the house in what is now the living room. This was enough to pique my interest. However, the main priority at the time was to push on with the renovation works, which were completed in the spring of 2020, just after lockdown. It was during the winter of 2020, once I had a bit more time to spare, that I started to investigate the history of the cottage in more detail. I initially contacted Kukubri History Society to see if it could be of any assistance in my research, and I would at this point like to thank Helen Bowick and David Devereaux, who were very helpful in pointing me in the right direction and providing photos, maps, which culminated in me writing up my findings and which ultimately has led me here. It seemed logical at the time to split the research into two different elements, the property and structural aspects forming one element, the other being the people and the lives of those who lived and owned in the cottage, who owned the cottage or lived there, should I say. The property element itself was relatively straightforward and predominantly involved interpreting the features and fabric of the cottage allied to the study of historic maps and photographs. Researching the owners and residents was a bit more time-consuming and involved quite a lot of online research and, to a lesser degree, talking to locals and family members of previous owners. Starting with a property then. Firstly, where is number 45? Well, it's found at the junction of St Cuthbert Street and Millburn Street, just past Tesco's, as most of you probably know. It's right next door to number 41 and 3, or what was the old Masonic Lodge, as most of us will know, and what is now called Castle View. It's one of the few properties on Millburn Street to have a front garden rather than fronting directly onto the footway and road. As many of those present will know, Millburn Street is one of the older roads in Kukubri, which has its origins as part of the old main route from Town End near the health centre and hospital, heading north from the town, which led to the old 1761 Tongan Bridge over the River Dee. Development on Millburn Street appears to have started around the Cornmill area in the lower part of the street and gradually extended southwards towards Town End. If we look at the John Gillone map from 1776, and in particular the area on the Green Line, it certainly indicates buildings of some kind on the site of number 45 and in the same orientation as the current numbers 41, 43 to 45. If not a residence or residences at that time, possibly sheds or workshops. There is some evidence within the southern gable of number 45 to substantiate the 1776 map detail. During renovation work in 2018-19, an early chimney breast, as I mentioned earlier, was discovered. It was built of old handmade clay bricks and within the wall and what is now the living room. Additionally, the walls either side of this chimney breast also indicate an earlier building due to the condition and consistency of the lime mortar and the style of masonry work, which was notably different from the stonework on the front or western elevation of the house. Some of the early maps indicate that there were quarries to the side and rear of number 45, and it is possible that these buildings shown here were associated with this work. But I should stress that this is purely supposition, as I've been able to establish what these early buildings were. Subsequent maps from 1821 and 1832 show gaps in the site, indicating perhaps that this earlier structure had been demolished, or it has simply been omitted. Who knows? It's not until 1843 that buildings are shown again on a town map in more detail. This map from 1854 indicates that the lower part of Millburn Street being well developed, with only intermittent development at that time south beyond the angled crossroads of St Cuthbert Street and Millburn Street. This map does indicate that separate structures were present on the current area of numbers 41, 43 and 45. And they are likely to have been dwellings by this time. It is notable that these were already set back and angled away from the main building line of Millburn Street, as the current buildings are. Moving on to number 45 specifically, no conclusive legal records have been found of a cottage at the location before 1889, although it's highly likely it had been a residence by 1854. The western and northern elevation walls are of a contemporary Victorian style, being about 2 feet thick and timber strapped internally and lime plastered. Included with this later work is the north gable chimney, which is built in a mixture of local stone and factory-made brick, originally up to the height of a single-storey pitch roof cottage, as evidence from the flashing chase markings on the wall at first floor level. Nothing remains of the older walls, rear walls from the structure, other than a slight return in stonework to the rear east corner of the living room, where it ties into the 1950s brickwork. The two western-facing window openings, including the sandstone stills and front door opening, appears to be from the mid-19th century single-storey cottage. If you look at this slide from possibly the late 1800s of St Cuthbert Street, if you look to the left-hand two carts, just above those you can see a row of cottages. These are in the area of 41, 43 and 45 Millburn Street, as they were at that time. Towards the end of the 19th, or possibly the beginning of the 20th century, numbers 41 and 43 were raised up to form two more stories, the uppermost being attic rooms with dormer windows. This left 45 as a single-storey cottage, sitting between taller number 43 to the north and number 47 to the south. The north chimney stack on number 45 itself was also extended to above number 43's ridge height, presumably to prevent the problem of downdrafts from the higher buildings either side of it, using factory-made Victorian clay bricks. By the mid-1800s, number 45 Millburn Street therefore appears to have been a single-storey, possibly two-room property with fairly limited floor area. The roof was double-pitched, with slate covering evidence from old photographs of the property taken from Millburn Street and from what is now Hope Dunbar Park at the rear. An interesting feature is found on the external corner of number 47. If you just look at the downpipe just to the almost to the left of the screen, you can just see bits of stone sticking out. These are coins which have been actually toothed, which toothing can be made out from the old photograph, sorry. This suggests that either an early building on the plot of number 45 had been demolished, or more likely that there had been an intention at the time of construction of 47 to continue with the existing building line onto the plot of number 45 and possibly the plots of 43 and 41 too. And if you can see the toothed coins in more detail on this photograph, which it does actually extend right up to roof height. Number 45 appears to have remained a small single-storey cottage sitting between the taller buildings either side, up until about 1953 or 54, when it was radically extended. This work comprised a cavity-walled brick extension built on top of the existing ground floor stone storey to the front and both gables. The old rear elevation was demolished and the property extended out by around 2 metres to the rear. Due to the steepness of the ground in the back garden, a substantial brick retaining wall was also built along the entire width of the property at the rear. All external house walls were wet dash rendered and painted white. New cast iron guttering, downpipes and soil pipes were installed, which were originally painted brown. Must have been the fashion at the time, although other colours were found of green, white and black, which have been applied over the years. All windows at this time were traditional timber sliding sash throughout. The new roof was double pitched as before, with predominantly Welsh slate to the rear, which was probably reclaimed from the original roof, and Lancashire slate to the front. Internally, the ground floor consisted of a living room, a dining room and kitchen with a pantry and a hot water tank cupboard. Stairs to the first floor were installed between the new living room and the dining room. On the first floor, there were two good-sized bedrooms which still overlook Millburn Street to the front, with a generous landing and bathroom to the rear. The two bedrooms had open fires with chimneys running parallel to the downstairs flues on both gables. The north bedroom chimney was built up against the existing late Victorian brick chimney. The 1950s bricks that were used at that time are of a different gauge to the earlier late Victorian examples, and a vertical straight join is visible virtually all the way up the chimney. You can just see that if I can get the mouse. And just about that line there, it just goes virtually all the way up, and it's purely because the difference in thickness and gauge of bricks. A third bedroom was created at some point in the late 1960s. To achieve this, the southernmost bedroom was split into two by the erection of a stud partition wall running north to south, along with a small passageway and sliding door. A full-height stairwell was initially incorporated in the 1950s work, but this was reduced in height, possibly to reduce heat loss around the same time as the creation of the third bedroom. Internally, the house appears to have remained relatively untouched structurally from the 1960s to the turn of the new millennium, with little indication of any further work being carried out other than decorating and general maintenance. The stripping of old wallpaper in the upstairs rooms in 2019 revealed names and dates from the 60s and 70s, which were written in pencil on the bare plaster by the children, presumably when their father was decorating the rooms. Outside, a lean-to shed was built against the rear kitchen wall at some point. A fine example of recycling and reuse. It was built with a multitude of old doors, pallets and other timbers, along with second-hand corrugated steel sheets. To allow access to the rear garden, a set of steel-framed stairs, again constructed of reused materials, was placed against the retaining wall. A lean-to greenhouse constructed of timber and corrugated clear plastic sheets was also erected outside the back door, possibly in the 1980s. In the photo, you can just see the roofs of both, which, as you can see, were fairly poor condition. Both these structures were in an advanced state of dereliction by 2018 and were some of the first things that I removed as part of the renovations. So, in summary then, there appears to have been three main phases of construction in the life of 45. The earliest being shown in yellow on the plan on the south gable. Given the condition of mortar and early hand-made bricks allied to the 18th and 19th century maps, this part is likely to date from around the mid-18th century. The second phase, in which the small single-storey cottage was built, is shown in green on the plan. It's likely to date from around the mid-19th century and is clearly of a later construction than the south gable. There was no definitive remains of the rear wall from this period, and it may have been obscured with the 1950s concrete foundations. The latest phase, which is shown in red, was undertaken around 1953 to 54 and also included adding a first floor to the property. The renovation work we carried out over 2018 to 2020 was predominantly remedial. However, some minor structural work structural alterations were all included in the work, including removing old supporting walls between the kitchen and dining room. They're just shown with as dotted lines on that plan, which was removing the old pantry and hot water tank cupboard, and also removing a supporting wall on the first floor to install an ensuite and main bedroom. Okay, moving on to the people. The earliest records of ownership discovered to date relate to number 45 are found in a charter of Nomedamus in favour of Mrs. Annie Graham or Steele from 1889, and a disposition document again from 1889 which indicates a transfer of ownership from Mrs. Annie Graham or Steele to a Mrs. Margaret Kirkpatrick or Ranshaw. Research suggests that Annie Graham was the daughter of William Graham, a labourer wood forester who was recorded in the valuation rolls has been a proprietor of property on Millburn Street from 1855 up until his death, aged 82, in 1889. The statutory register of death states that he died of cystitis at his home in Millburn Street on January the 3rd. Going back slightly, the census of 1851 indicates that Annie lived in Millburn Street and at the time was married to a James Steele, a shoemaker journeyman. They had two young daughters, Jane and Mary. Annie and James appear to have moved at some point to the Maxwell Town area of Dumfries. As a present number along Millburn Street appears only to have been established around 1889, no other records have been found relating specifically to number 45 before this time. The property stated as being in the ownership of William Graham from 1855 to 1889 were variously recorded as house number 102 Millburn Street, well, there's no 102 Millburn Street now, House Millburn Street, and House and Garden Millburn Street. Whilst it's not possible to definitively establish that it was number 45 that William Graham owned and occupied, the association of his daughter Annie transferring ownership of it in the same year he died suggests that the property did belong to him and was sold after he died. It's therefore highly likely that number 45, under another name or number, was inhabited from at least 1855. Annie Graham continued to live in Maxwellton for the remainder of her life and died of pleurisy on the 9th of May 1907, aged 80. From the valuation rolls in 1890, the house was documented as then belonging to Margaret Ranshaw, or erroneously Ramshaw, an apparent misspelling of a name on the valuation rolls. Her maiden name was Kirkpatrick, and Mrs. Kirkpatrick, likely Margaret Kirkpatrick, or Ranshaw, was recorded at number 45 in the list of voters for 1889. In the 1881 census, Margaret Ranshaw was living with her brother, Thomas Kirkpatrick, formerly a cotton weaver, and her sister-in-law, Mary Jane, at 31 Brown's Close in Kirkcudbright. The census states that Margaret was already a widow at that time. Margaret was born on the 3rd of October 1836 in Kirkcudbright, and her father was Robert Kirkpatrick, also a weaver in the town. Their parish register at the time simply states their home as Millburn. Margaret married William Ranshaw, a baker, but have been unable to find a record of their marriage or where they lived as a couple in Scotland. Ranshaw or Ramshaw is a name associated with the North East and Lincolnshire areas of England, which may explain the lack of records north of the border. This old photograph of the cottage on the screen, possibly earlier 20th century, portrays quite an idyllic image with roses and shrubs growing in the garden. The person standing at the door is unknown, but Margaret Ranshaw perhaps. Margaret Ranshaw owned 45 Millburn Street from 1889 through to 1908. Whilst living at the property herself for the first 6 years of ownership, Margaret rented the property out from 1896 to 1908 to tenants, these being 1896 to 1905, a Gilbert McKee, and from 1906 to 1908, William Clingan, both of these recorded as Masons. From 1897 to 1908, Margaret lived with her brother, Thomas Kirkpatrick, who was then recorded as a farmer, and her sister-in-law, Mary Jane, at Burnside Nursery to the north edge of Kirkcudbright. Margaret Ranshaw died on May the 24th, 1908, of peritonitis. The property appears to have been left to her sister-in-law, Mary Jane, who is recorded as being the proprietor, but not the occupier, from 1909 to 1919. From the valuation rolls, there were a number of tenants who lived in the house during this period. These include, from 1909 to 1913, Daniel Kenny, a professional golfer. From 1914 to 1916, James McKee, an ostler. There's no record of an occupier for 1970, possibly for obvious reasons with the First World War. And from 1918 to 1919, John Carson, who was a coach painter. Mary Jane Kirkpatrick died on the 14th of December 1920 of heart failure. The cottage then became the property of a son, Robert Kirkpatrick. Robert continued to lease the cottage out for a short period, with the last recorded tenant occupier being a Mrs. Margaret Hartwell, who lived there for around 2 years in 1920 and 1921. The Land Registry of Scotland intimates that the property was sold by Robert Kirkpatrick to a Peter James Gordon McAdam, who worked as a saddler, on the 1st of September 1921. Peter James Gordon McAdam tragically only owned the property for just over a year before his death on the 19th of September 1922, aged just 45, leaving a widow, Marion, and a 1-year-old son, Peter Gordon McAdam. Although the valuation rolls from 1925 through to 1940 record Marion as being the occupier of number 45, her family have advised that following the death of her husband, Marion, along with her son, moved into Police Close on High Street in Kirkcudbright to live with relatives. During this time, 45 was rented out to various people up to around 1952. Marion herself worked as a housekeeper for Osborne's, the local funeral directors, and eventually moved into a house just along from Police Close on High Street in Kirkcudbright. The registers of Scotland state that Peter Gordon McAdam became the owner of number 45 on the 26th of May 1952. At this time, the house was recorded as being called Rose Cottage. 1952 appears to have been quite a notable year for Peter, who married Agnes Hislop McLaughlin, known as Nancy, in the same year. They remained in number 45 for their entire married life and had 2 children, Gordon, who was born in 1953, and Jane, born in 1959. It was around 1953-54, Peter McAdam significantly extended the cottage, with the majority of the work being carried out by Peter's cousins, Andy and Davy Campbell, I believe the present Andy Campbell's father and uncle, respectively. This is a photograph of Peter and Nancy. Peter initially worked with Andy Fairweather, a mechanic at Tongland Quarry, before serving in Burma during the Second World War. After his return from his time in the services, Peter worked as an electrician with South of Scotland Electricity Board, which eventually became Scottish Power. 45 Millburn Street remained the McAdam family home, and it was where both Gordon and Jane grew up and eventually flew the nest. Nancy died in 2007, and Peter moved into Merce House Care Home in Kirkcudbright in 2016 due to ill health. The house then remained empty until October 2018, when it was sold to my wife and I. Following the renovations and alterations, number 45 is again called Rose Cottage, and as befits the name, roses are still growing in the front garden. Thank you. Okay, you take it off.
I'll just start now then. My name's Donald Tait, so first thing to say is thanks very much for having me here. It's great to be here in Kirkcudbright, especially having travelled all the way from Borg. It's a foggy night, so I was very pleased to get the email from Carol inviting me to speak to this group. There was a slight degree of trepidation or apprehension, I would have to admit, because in the email she did use this very almost chilling phrase about Cumstoun, quote, so familiar to folk from Kirkcudbright. Well, I'm not actually from Kirkcudbright, so it was a lot less familiar to me. I'm a CD boy at heart, but I know you won't hold that against me. Having said all that, I have done some research into Cumstoun House as part of the Building Biographies project, which has already been mentioned. So if Mike can give one shameless plug for the project, sure I can give another shameless plug as well. It's really, there's some outstanding material there and it's well worth having a look at. So I'm here to talk about the Cumstoun House and the Maitland family. The quote here, the ahe brains, they Maitlands, but they're a wheen harum scarum devils. I'm sure everyone knows words like wheen and harum scarum. I don't really need to translate these. The quote's actually from a book, East Galloway Sketches, by a character called Alexander Trotter, who is from a well-known literary family based in Auchencairn. The family have written lots and lots of books, and they're really worth looking at. This particular volume almost should be on the bookshelf of anyone interested in Galloway for its observations on the people, the places, the customs, the traditions round in Galloway round about that time. I decided to use this quote just to give a sense of the fact that I think in the case of Cumstoun, the family and the house are possibly intertwined in a way that most other houses of this nature aren't anymore. I think possibly maybe Ardwell might still be in the hands of the McCulloch family in some shape or form. But almost a lot of all the other houses, including the ones in the Building Biographies project, like Ardgrennan, Sennick, Thrieve, well, Thrieve wasn't in the Buildings Biography project, but all these houses have changed hands, sometimes for perfectly valid reasons, and sometimes they've been very well looked after. But as I say, they're not always in the hands of the same family. That almost makes Cumstoun unique. Other houses no longer exist, of which Earlston is quite a good example. But in this case, the house has been in the same family for, well, that's coming up for 200 years. I'll talk very briefly about the origins of the Maitland family. I don't want to say too much about this, but they originally came from the southwest of Scotland, and they were descended from the border family of Lauderdale. Now, this family had extensive holdings and properties in that area. For example, the enormous house, it's almost a chateau, Thirlston House. Now, I don't know if any of you watched the Antiques Roadshow a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, that was actually from Thirlston. That just gives you an idea of the size of Thirlston House. It's on a much kind of grander scale than Cumstoun House, I would have to say. It's on almost a completely different level. But Cumstoun House, we have the present Cumstoun Main. The family did, as well as having property, they also acquired various lands, Cumstoun Mains, Ingleston, Kemplerton, etc. The family head at that time was a character called Adam Maitland, who was quite an interesting character. He'd been in the East Indies before returning to marry, and this was a very shrewd marriage, a Stuart MacWham. Apparently Stuart in those days was a name used by girls as well as boys, and she was the heiress to the Dundrennan estate. He was an interesting character, and it was he who commissioned Thomas Hamilton to build Cumstoun, he'd bought the site and the estate from the Earl of Selkirk in the early part of the 19th century. This is possibly just about my favourite slide, basically. It's from a book called The Photographic View Album of Kirkcudbright and Vicinity, published by James McSkimming, watchmaker and jeweller in 1901. It gives a really nice impression of the place. This is what you would see as you're walking along the Tungland Road, the D-Walk, as you're walking out to Cumstoun. This is basically what you see with the wide expanse of lawn. When that takes you down to the river. The conservatory you'll see on the left, it's no longer there. And there's a rather ugly canopy. If you look at the bay window in the middle of the house and the two sort of adjacent windows, there's quite an ugly canopy. That's all been taken down, and that's to allow the drawing room to have a little more light. Just before I carry on, what I'll do is I'll pass around a couple of items. We'll start this one here. This is a book about Thomas Hamilton, who's the architect that designed. So if you just have a look at that, he designed Cumstoun. This is a 1912 supplement to the Scots Pictorial, which is basically a six-page description of Cumstoun as it was in 1912. So I'll just have a look at that, and you can just pass them around. You can see it's a very elegant-looking house, and as I say, it was commissioned by Adam Maitland, and this is the architect. a guy called Thomas Hamilton. Thomas Hamilton might be known to some of you with a sort of inclination towards architectural history. He was a Glasgow boy, but now, of course, is widely known for his work in Edinburgh. His most successful work, of course, was the Royal Scottish, the Royal High Schools, and that work really cements his place in the sort of history of Scottish architecture, the architecture of Edinburgh specifically. A number of his other buildings still stand. For example, the Royal College of Physicians, that's on South Clerk Street. Also the Dean Orphanage, the Bedlam Theatre at the far end of George IV Bridge, which actually helped construct George IV Bridge. The Bedlam Theatre was originally a free church. Nearer to hand, they didn't actually build anything other than Cumstoun in Galloway. But if you fancy a jaunt up to Ayr, not everyone does fancy a jaunt up to Ayr, but you might. So we have things like Ayr Town Hall, the Burns Monument at Alloway, and the assembly rooms. So they can all be seen. The buildings I've described so far, they're all kind of public buildings. He was designing houses, private houses. The one on the left is one called Arthur Lodge in Dalkeith Road in Edinburgh. So if you kind of look at them, they're in the same sort of scale as Cumstoun House. Arthur Lodge was built as part of a sort of the first kind of villa estate development, really. Each villa was intended to be, and I quote, to realise the desire for a house like a country gentleman, but more modest and closer to the life of the town. So it's quite a sort of modest house for a fairly well-to-do person living in a town rather than maybe out in the state somewhere like Cumstoun. It's still standing. The other one on the right-hand side is Falcon House, Morningside. This is a slightly larger mansion home built by Hamilton, but latterly it was owned by the Bartholomew family of map fame. It was actually demolished in 1909, so that one doesn't actually still stand anymore. The one that I think possibly has most similarities to Cumstoun would be a building called Lathallen House in Polmont. This was built for the Lehrman factory of Polmont, and it gradually passed through various hands till at one point in time it was owned by the pretty wealthy Salvesen family, who obviously made a lot of money in shipping, etc. It was sold off by them, went through various owners, allowed to decay, and then mysteriously caught fire in 2006. So if you look at Polmont House now, Lathallen House now, this is a kind of a warning as to what might or might not happen if you don't actually look after and cherish these stately homes. That's just a wreck. And that is what can happen. Again, as I say, an example back in the day might be Earlston House that's completely gone. So hopefully from the above slides that I've shown, it's quite clear that we can see that Hamilton was building some quite substantial, or in the case of the Royal High School, some very substantial properties. They were for wealthy clients, they were of a high standard. And so I suppose one of the questions which might arise is, how did the family get the money to build a house? Well, I did mention early on that they had land holdings, so they got income from renting out the properties in the various farms. But this Adam Maitland, who was the instigator, the commissioner of Cumstoun, he'd been a doctor in the East Indies. He was also a very successful farmer, a respected member of the prestigious Royal Highland and Agricultural Society of Scotland. We also went on to make a number of pretty shrewd investments. This slide here shows him in 1813. He became a director of the British Linen Company. Now, this was a precursor to obviously to the British Linen Bank. This was a particularly shrewd move because at this point in time, the linen industry was Scotland's premier industry in the 18th century. This being at a time when the Industrial Revolution hadn't quite taken off. So people were making a lot of money out of linen, which was as I say, the primary industry and formed the basis for the later cotton, jute and woolen industries. And so buying shares in the linen or becoming a director would have been a fairly shrewd investment. Now, the minute you mention the East Indies, you automatically think of the East India Company. And this slide shows that by 1837, he'd become a stockholder with the East India Company, which was basically running India on behalf of the British state. Now, some people are making absolute fortunes out of the East India Company, becoming seriously rich. As just a shareholder, he would have been making sort of steady money and becoming wealthy and respectable. According to the the new statistical account, Adam was devoted to, and I'll quote, devoted to objects of public usefulness and private benevolence. For example, he helped build roads, helped build bridges, helping the poor, etc. So the question arises, why is there a family rumour that he was in fact involved in opium smuggling? This, of course, opium smuggling at this point in time, highly lucrative, essentially involving smuggling Indian opium into China in exchange for China tea, which was then sold in Britain and was commanding absolutely huge prices. So the opportunity was there to make a fortune. Now, if this is at the minute just a rumour, but is there any actual evidence for this? I had a look around, and the only evidence I came up with, and it's not conclusive evidence, but this is a document dated 1800, and it's actually a page from, and I'll quote the title of the book, "A register of ships employed in the service of the Honourable East India Company, including the managing owners, principal officers, surgeons and pursers, with the dates of their sailing and arrival." It's by a Charles Hardy. So what you've got here, if you look at the yellow highlight, you can see SUR Adam Maitland. So this Adam Maitland was a surgeon. This was a surgeon on a ship that was sailing from India to China, and he had access to opium. Now, does that mean he was an opium smuggler? I have no idea, but it's certainly how rumours might start. And that wasn't the only voyage that he made. This particular book, because they list them making 3 or 4 different voyages on different ships, all going out from India to China as part of this particular trade. Anyway, regardless of the sources of their income, what did they get for their money? Well, let's have a look at the actual house itself. This is a fairly early photograph, dated around 1872. Basically, Tudor Gothic architectural style, various elements such as pointed arches, intricate stonework, large windows, some with Gothic arches, built of whin rubble. That was possibly an economy measure. Hamilton, as an architect, was known to be quite extravagant, and in actual fact had bankrupt a couple of his clients, so they would have to be careful. There's red sandstone dressing as well, which obviously enhances the property. In around about the 1890s, it was substantially altered by the well-known architectural firm of Kinnear and Peddy, mainly involving the front of the house, various extensions on the north front. At this stage, there is actually no conservatory. A conservatory was added on later, as we'll see. The choice of Kinnear and Peddy as architects to do that was quite interesting. Again, like Hamilton, they were a pretty well-respected, pretty expensive firm, and they wouldn't have worked cheap, that's for sure. The other point to mention in that context is at the time, they were doing quite a lot of work in southwest Scotland, including houses like Thrieve, Sennick. They also built a nice parish church at Cockerbush in Suffolk. I don't know if any of you know that. That's really quite an attractive building. So the firm would have been well known to the Maitland family. This is a slightly later photo, this one here. What you can see here is they've added a nice conservatory. This is, again, the south-facing side. That's the bit that you can see as you come up the river. The conservatory basically linked, at that point in time, the drawing room to the lawns by bridging the steep slope in between them. In 1895, this conservatory was moved to the side of the house, and we can see that in later photos, at which after that, it was removed altogether. I'm not quite sure when it was removed altogether. Just to say, this presentation, I will be using a lot of stuff that's freely available from public sources, usually web-based and quite easy to find. Sometimes you might have to pay a small price for it if it's, for example, some digital newspapers or census records. These are chargeable, but they're all in the public domain. What isn't in the public domain so much is the second sort of group of materials I'll be showing you, which is actually directly from the family album. And these, as far as I'm aware, haven't been seen at all. So some of the stuff I'll be showing you today, hopefully is stuff that you might not have seen before, and there'll be some of that coming up in the next 3 or 4 slides, hopefully. This is another nice slide again. This is the north of that. This is actually the entrance. As you come up this sort of sweeping drive, this is the way you would come into the house. I'm passing around a couple of items. There's one from the Scots Pictorial, which is showing you the other photographs. This is showing as I say, the front of the house. As you come up to the house, in the front of the house, you see this little object. This is by far and away the oldest object associated with the building. Just to the right as you come into it, it's a medieval font, and we think that possibly it came from Dundrennan Abbey. It's sitting on, as you can see, a fluted pedestal, which is also obviously medieval, although the two particular pedestal and the font itself don't seem to belong together. There was a rumour that it came from Tongan, but on the balance of probability, it's likely to have come from Dundrennan. Dundrennan was, of course, owned for a long time by the Maitland family, although they didn't particularly take care of it. And I think they might just have thought, well, we'll fancy that, we'll move that from Dundrennan to Cumstoun. Time for a quick peek inside the house now. Are we doing the thing? Yeah, we're okay. This is the drawing room. Now, that's pretty much the same as it would have been in Hamilton's day. To my mind, it's the nicest room in the house. It's got lovely lights, it's got lovely views. It's got the elaborate Gothic woodwork in the window jambs and on the door panels. Quite a simple white marble fireplace, but it does have wonderful lights and a wonderful view over the Dee. This is just another couple of shots of the drawing room. That's the fireplace. This is us going into the hall. I suppose the main feature of the hall might be the plaster work in the ceiling, which is very ornate, particularly attractive, I would have to say. This is just another slide of the hall. We'll move into you can see the stairs going up on the left, up to the first floor. Various family portraits, etc. The sort of typical things you'd get in a country house of this period, of this style. This is a china cabinet. This is in the dining room now. And this is that's the dining room table. I would have to say that in terms of furniture and fittings, etc., Cumstoun House doesn't really match up to some of the bigger country houses like Thirlston, obviously like Drumlarnock, which are quite spectacular pieces of furniture. Cumstoun has no Dutch masters, no French masters, no Raphaels, no medieval tapestries, etc. It does have some interesting fancy portraits, but there's no sort of Chippendale furniture. That's just good, solid stuff, really. As I say, the furniture is not particularly at the top of the range, but it's all good, solid stuff. When you move outside from the house and into the grounds, the grounds have the usual sort of features of houses of this period. Again, fairly typical. They have tennis courts on the lawn, which was used for tennis parties. Some were grass, but they've also got a hard court. You can still see where this was. There was a 9-hole golf course with a rumour that at least one of the holes players had to pitch over the house, as well as, I don't know how that would have worked. There was a croquet lawn used on occasions for the South West Scotland Championships. There was a fish pond stocked with perch. And there's many walks and paths through the woods. Some of you might have already have been through some of the walks and paths. They're all being restored. And the idea is that they will become available again. Possibly the most, just to go back to the house for a minute, the most expensive items in the house probably would have been in the middle of the 19th century. The house had a particularly spectacular library owned by, at that time acquired by Lord Dundrennan, who's a fairly well-known Edinburgh establishment figure. He was a lawyer, he was an MP, he was quite a prominent establishment figure, and he had this wonderful library of books, which did end up getting sold off, sadly. But in the grounds itself, obviously you have this castle, which is essentially a medieval tower house, now ruinous, of course. It predates the actual house, of course, by several hundred years. It's allegedly the home of a prominent 16th century poet, Alexander Montgomery, whose most famous poem was the Cherry and the Sleigh, written in the late 16th century. And he was a very prominent poet in the court of James VI. Of course, it doesn't really have anything to do with the Maitland family. It predates it by some considerable period. This is an ice house, which a lot of houses, but not all of them, they're relatively unusual. But Cumstoun does have quite a good example of an ice house, obviously semi-subterranean cold stores. They're early forms of refrigeration for preserving foods, fish, meat, bottled drinks. The ice was obtained from nearby rivers, while it couldn't be much closer to the Tarf or the Dee. If properly compacted, the ice could, apparently, and with proper drainage, the ice would keep for upwards of a year. It wasn't part of the original house. I mean, if you look at the Ordnance Survey maps, the first map for 1854, there's no trace of the ice house, but it was added on as part of the extensions in the late 19th century that I mentioned earlier on. The Tarf, yeah, as I say, you could have picked up your ice from the Tarf. Slide 23, we have the coachman's house. In the front of the coachman's house, you can see there was a rose garden. To the left, you'll see the large garden. Well, that's the walled garden. We'll see more of that in a minute. Coachman's house. Obviously, there's a gardener's house. This is the garden. It's a fair size. It's a slightly smaller than a football pitch, but it's a decent size. And it would certainly have been able to produce produce, cut flowers, fruit and veg for the house. They would have grown a lot of fruit trees on the south-facing wall. There's a knob at the front of the garden, a sundial, all the sort of typical features you would get of a walled garden of that particular period. It was a greenhouse, now ruined, but at one time, again, that would have been used to extend the growing season to produce plants, etc. Grapes were grown there at one time. This is obviously a photo from the family album. This shows a character called Henry Walk, who he wasn't actually the head gardener, he was a gardening labourer. This was taken in 1899. And we can confirm the fact that Walk was a gardener because in the 1881 and 1891 census, Henry Walk is down as living at Cumstoun Mains, working as a general garden labourer. So this is quite a nice example of how official records, like the census records, and the items from family albums, they just sort of corroborate each other and seem to sort of work quite nicely together. Photograph on the left, again, obviously from the family album, showing the garden with sort of the usual perennials, and as I say, I've mentioned, fairly typical stuff. The plant on the right is a thing called the South African figwort. Now, apparently at this point in time, this is round about 1900, Cumstoun was noted, first of all, for its snowdrops, which I think are still quite well known and for custom. If you want to see bluebells, you go to Castleman Woods. If you want to see snowdrops, you can come to Cumstoun or various other houses. Actually, the estates at this point in time, they were all quite competitive about their gardens. Your garden had to be at least as good, if not better, than some of the other gardens. And it was very competitive. And there was a 1912 edition of a magazine called Gardening Illustrated, which did emphasise the fact that the Cape figwort plant at Cumstoun was a particularly hardy and magnificent specimen, which must have pleased the head gardener at the time, who was a character called John Buchanan. Again, you can confirm this by census records. This is just, I feel, quite a nice photograph of John Buchanan. Well, it says children, and actually 2 children. Wife and daughter, 2 daughters. He was a fairly long-serving member of staff. The census records show him from 1901 to 1921, and he actually had the gardener's cottage, so he wasn't just a gardening labourer, he was your head honcho, as it were. So that was quite a nice picture of his children, again, from the family album. Probably my particular favourite items in the family album, not so much photographs, but they're albums of a different sort. This is the visitor's book, basically. Now, these are absolutely wonderful sources for people who are interested in all sorts of social and economic history. They're great sources for charting the comings and goings to a house, because they tell in sort of great detail who was visiting the house at what point in time, so you can get insights into friends and visitors, both from the locality and further afield. There's a very, very similar to this particular visitor book in Lee Castle in Lanark, and they all do the same sort of thing, which is detail in a book in this form who all the visitors were. I don't know if you can make out the writing in this one terribly clearly, but we can see this is some months in 1896, and there'll be some very well-known personal names and places. So, for example, there's visitors from Castlewig, Arbigland, which was, I think, in the hands of the Blacketts at that time, Auchendolly, Suffolk, Ardwell, which was in the hands of the Stuarts. So this is a good example of sort of network of friends and visitors that a house like this would have, basically. There's a Susie Stewart from Knockinshee. And this is just one example. It'd be a fascinating exercise just to trace some of these lesser-known names. I know one of them was a soldier. I suspect he was maybe coming to court one of the girls at the time. That's just a suspicion. But as I say, the visitors' books to me are absolutely fabulous, as are game registers. Maybe sometimes not always for the squeamish, I would have to say. This one belongs to, as we can see, an SCM, who's a Stuart Cairns Maitland. Let's check how we're doing for time here. Are we okay for time? Yeah. So the game register, obviously this is going to tell you what they were shooting, basically. This is very similar, just before I go into one in that I saw the other day that I was visiting Thrieve House. Now, Thrieve House apparently are now making available as on public display their archives, including things like their game register. This one's obviously part of the film album, which I suspect hasn't been shown before, so this is the first time we're getting a look at this. But this is an early entry for 1985, I think, which shows what they were shooting. For example, partridge, grouse, wild fowl, woodcock, snipe, hares, rabbits, etc. They were showing where the shootings took place at Cumstoun, Stockerton, St Mary's Isle, Borland of Calais, Glasserton, who was in the group. For example, there's a Captain Hope, who would almost certainly be from St Mary's Isle, I would have thought. There was an Admiral Kennedy. It also gives an indication of the weather conditions. And again, it's building up this sense of a network of country house people who all went to the same, they visited each other, they all attended each other's shoots, etc., etc. As I say, not necessarily for the squeamish, but in this case, the number of shots on this particular shoot pale in comparison to those for a character called Oliver Robinson, who was Lord Ribon. He was without doubt the greatest game shot Britain has ever produced. And from 1867 until 1823, he meticulously recorded in his game books that he accounted for no fewer than 556,813 game birds, which is, on one occasion he downed 28 pheasants in 60 seconds at a shooting party on the Sandringham estate. This guy, he's Top Gun, there's no doubt about that. Apparently dropped dead in the heather after a successful day's grouse shooting, so you might think that's proper justice or not, I don't know. We can just have a look at what a shooting party looked like. Again, from the family album, this is the Maitland family. I'll maybe just point out a couple of family members. There's this one in the second from the left with a shotgun and a fairly magnificent moustache. That's David Maitland. He was head of the family at this time. This is, when's this? 1890, I would say, yeah. The lady standing at the back on the right, that's his daughter Geraldine Veronica Maitland. I'll be saying more about her lately, time permitting. And a rather youngish looking boy at the front holding the dog, that's Graham MacDowell Maitland, and again we'll be hearing more about him. I mean, they didn't just spend their time blasting birds out the sky, they also went on more peaceful pursuits. This shows the family out cycling. Cycling became very popular at this time, both for men and almost more so for women. This was the first chance that maybe ladies had a chance to get out on bikes, although initially they were required to sit in the back of a tandem, lest they got too excited at the front. This is very similar to a photograph I wish I'd shown, but it shows ladies of the Free Church in Auchencairn, just along the road. Very similar pose. There are 4 or 5 ladies from the Free Church, and they're all standing by their bikes. You just get a sense that they're going to have a really good time cycling out, enjoying the newfound freedom. So as I say, cycling is an incredibly popular hobby, both for men and women. I mentioned the Lady Geraldine Veronica Maitland. She's second from the right in this photograph. I'm just going to highlight her, just an example of the sort of records you can get and the picture you can build up by using photographs from the family album of the life that this lady might have led. That's her looking rather wistful, I would have thought. That's the conservatory. There was definitely a conservatory, and that's her looking at the plants. She'd been born in 1887. She was the daughter of David Maitland and Eleanor Frances Scott. And in many ways, she does typify the life of a woman of her generation and social class. Like many of her contemporaries, she would have been taught skills, feminine skills like sewing, playing a musical instrument, but also, and this is what I'm going to highlight now, drawing and sketching skills, which was considered a particularly feminine and creative way to express yourselves. And in Geraldine's case, she pasted some of these drawings and sketches in a scrapbook, although she didn't actually call it a scrapbook. For some reason, she called it a scribble book. So here are some of the things she put in her scribble book. And this is I think it's quite a charming little watercolour. I don't know if you can read it, so I'll read it out for you. The lady above with the brush still exists, I believe, in Portrush. She's slender and neat, with the tiniest feet, and renowned worldwide for her blush. So, yeah. I mean, let's face it, most limericks are really either really filthy or really quite amusing. This is one of the amusing ones. She also did a couple of really quite nice ones. This is a gypsy encampment, and I'm beginning to wonder if these were the Tinkler gypsies. Did anybody go to the talk that Threave House did? I think it was a Threave House. Was that about Tinkler gypsies? Yeah, I believe that was very good. They were particularly known to come down to Dumfries and Galway. So that's one of their encampments. That's another one. And they're quite accomplished watercolours, I'd have to say. Again, I've seen this kind of thing in various family albums, but this is really quite a nice example. This is, again, just wee little cartoony things. This is a tennis match. Obviously, as I mentioned, the tennis courts earlier on. They're clearly in use for highly competitive games between Kirkcudbright and Cumstoun. Geraldine went on to get married. She got married in Balcarry Bay. It does note that her wedding was quite a quiet affair as the bride was in mourning. I suspect she would be in mourning because a couple of years ago, a couple of months ago, her mother had died shortly. Had died shortly before she got married, so that was why she would be in mourning. Is that everything about that slide? Yeah. Geraldine had 3 brothers. Just to kind of build up a picture of this particular family. This is the eldest of the 3 brothers, Stuart Cairns Maitland. He'd been born October 1873, educated at Eton, and like all people who would inherit the estate, they had a coming out party. There's a mention, this is 1894, I believe. Again, if you look at newspaper accounts, it can be fascinating for bringing to light the details of people and places. For example, this one mentions the Selkirk Arms Hotel was still going strongly at that point in time. It mentions a character called a Mr. Fisher, from Flatdale, who was the oldest tenant, who was born on the farm and had been a tenant for over 50 years. He was to enter the Gordon Highlanders as a soldier, promoted to captain and killed in the Boer War, fighting as part of the campaign to relieve Ladysmith. A marble headstone was erected over his grave. A memorial service in his honour took place in the Greyfriars Episcopal Church. I think at this point in time, the family as a church would have used the Episcopal Church rather than the standard parish church. They seem to have been Episcopalians. Now, according to family legend, shortly after his death, his mother died of grief, and that would have been the mother that I referred to earlier on, who his sister was in mourning for when she got married. This was the middle brother, Claude Archibald Scott Maitland, another soldier, the Gordon Highlanders. He was actually christened in the private chapel at Cally, which no longer exists. A lovely building in its day, no longer with us. He actually went on to inherit the house, obviously because his elder brother had died. He was next in line. Like his elder brother, he had served in the Boer War, and again, where he was actually wounded in the Boer War, and he went on to fight in the First World War, where, as you can see here, he was mentioned in dispatches, and he helped set up the local Home Guard. If you look at the dispatches, the Secretary of State for War on the bottom right-hand side, that was a certain Winston Churchill. This is the youngest brother. This is Graham MacDowell Maitland. We're going to hear a little bit about him. He was a particularly renowned athlete. That's his, you can see a picture of his oars there. He was educated at Marlborough College and Cambridge University. He was an excellent all-round sportsman and an especially capable rower. He was actually part of the winning crew in the 1901 boat race. He was also, I'm just going to have a glass of water. In his younger day, a little bit of a rascal or a rogue, apparently. This is the Cambridge University student magazine called The Granter, and it's got an account of Graham MacDowell Maxwell here. And a very friendly, it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek account of his early life at Cumstoun, which included a prank he chose to play. I'm going to quote in full because obviously you'll be unable to read that. But this is a bit of mischief that this young gentleman got up to. While still of tender years and innocent aspect, he made a highly ingenious and determined attempt at manslaughter, which was only thwarted owing to the soil at the bottom of the ravine, down which his victim, a short-sighted and aged lady, whose mission it was to instruct the juvenile members of the family in the French language, was precipitated being rendered soft and innocuous by Scottish mist. The Home authorities, on careful investigation of the supposed accident, discovered the skillfully sawn legs of a rustic bench in close proximity to a tree stump on which the bait, in the shape of a little sister, apparently absorbed in the perusal of a tear-stained copy of a French first exercise book, had been placed. So apparently he set up this little sister to pretend to be reading a French book beside this bench. The old dear teaching the family of French has come down to help the girl. She sat on the bench and she's been hurtled down the grassy slopes into the mud. Now, he paid a very heavy price for this particular prank, because in a couple of weeks later, he was shortly packed off to a boarding school in England. It does then go on to mention that his pranks continued when he would come back up on holiday, and I'll quote again, "He became an expert in the use and abuse of a spade, for he has considerably depreciated the value of his ancestral estate by his frenzied pursuit of buried treasure." So he's obviously gone round the ground with a spade trying to dig up the treasure. So this is probably a good example of a harum-scarum devil. Of course, sadly, another soldier, he was killed in the First World War in the fighting around Ypres, fighting with Irish Guards. An eyewitness account of his death by the family shows that he was last seen shooting with his revolver a German who was trying to bayonet one of our wounded. So this is at 1914. This is before sort of trench warfare attrition has set in. This is real hand-to-hand fighting, and this guy unfortunately hasn't made it. Initially, the family were told that he was missing in action, but of course later on they got a telegram to confirm that he was dead. So that's the three sons, the three brothers of Geraldine were all soldiers. David Maitland was the father of these boys, and he, of course, was too old to fight in the war, although he did help with recruitment and organising accommodation for Belgian refugees who fled from the invading Germans at the start of the war. Also, he was managing the house and the estate. By this time, living in the house with his second wife, there was a staff of a cook, a kitchen maid, 2 table maids, 2 housemaids, and of course there are other workers required to run the estate, many of whom lived in nearby accommodation, such as the lodges, usually with their wives and families. This included a carpenter, a dressmaker, estate labourers, a chauffeur, a gardener, an engineer, etc. All of which made it quite an expensive business to run. So the family had to devise various income streams, as well as letting, as well as the farms that they owned. They would have to sell off various bits and pieces. The first top slide, the top half of the slide shows them selling off some wood at Kempleton, I think it was, yeah, as well as letting out one of the farms at Ingleston. There were various other wheezes to raise cash. This lady here is a Lady Alice Anne, Duchess of Buckingham, and Chandos. Now, the idea was that she would rent the house out, and she's rent the Court Circular in the Times for April 1919 notes that she did rent Cumstoun for 3 months. She came all the way up from London to enjoy the delights of rural Kirkcudbrightshire. I think she lasted 3 months and then went back. But another let was to a slightly more local person. This was an Evelyn Cross. Now, that's a familiar name. She was from Earlston. So again, she had been widowed in 1919 when her husband Malcolm Cross had died. So again, the main house at Cumstoun was being rented out, but this time to a close neighbour. Evelyn Cross was later to return to Earlston and became well known for her charity work and participation in local community fairs in Borg. A family member of the time notes that at this particular time, this form of activity, letting out your house, could have been quite good to people who tended to bring their own staff with them. That put quite a stress on the family. But that was just another way of raising money. Other sources of income were for obviously shooting lets And also, I've been told that the family, and I can't really verify this, but they did raise money from a quarry on the estate, which was used for to provide stone as ballast to build roads. I don't know much about that. If anyone could tell me anything about that, I'd be quite pleased to hear about it. There were financial pressures, but notwithstanding the financial pressures, they still had time to go off and enjoy themselves. This shows them going off to the Dumfries Ball. This was in 1900. A slightly later ball was this one here, which took place. The point about this side, again, it shows, if you look at the list of the names on the left-hand side, it just shows you how many of the families that were still around, some of the names that own the properties. For example, you've got the McCullochs. At Suffolk, you've got the Thomases, Danevale, the Duncans, and Lesby, Mr. McKee, the Fortunes that's still at Bengairn, etc., etc. And again, it just sort of reinforces this idea of the network of social connections that these people had. One of the features of the Maitland occupancy has been engagement with the family within the community. For example, they'd be served in local councils, GPs, etc. Also, they do a lot of fundraising for good causes, and there's dozens of examples of these. I'll just pick a very small number. This is a very early example. This is the 1809 Sunday School treat. I suspect that's the Sunday school, again from the family album, I suspect that's the Sunday school from the Episcopal Church, which is the one they tended to use. And also there's a newspaper article which says, a newspaper article from that particular church, which says, the Sunday school were entertained by Mrs. Maitland at Cumstoun. It's a sumptuous day and magnificent Christmas tree. Each child was a delighted recipient of 2 or 3 presents. So that's just one example. This was a pageant that was presented by the Girl Guides. That was using the grounds at Cumstoun. This is obviously a Jesse M. King thing. If you look at some of the names of the people who took part, you'll probably recognise some of them. I'm just going to have to sort of fast forward now, and I'll finish up in a couple of minutes maybe. This is another, just a Cumstoun sale of work basically for the nursing service. Just another fundraising, etc. People would come to the grounds, they'd possibly get to see it. This was in 1939, possibly get a tour of the grounds, etc. We're now moving almost into modern times. This is a lady some of you might know, a lady Hope Maitland, doing a fundraising. Her husband was Adam Maitland, and again, he was heavily involved in scouting. So that's just another example of the family interacting with the community. This slide here is an interesting one. It relates to a project, and this is another shameless plug. This is a plug for a few of you are involved possibly in this oral history project, which was conducted a few years ago, whereby people were invited to go out and talk to people who'd lived in Dumfries and Galloway for all their working lives. And I think some of you have been involved in this. This character here is, his name is Archie Wright, and I've chosen him for this just to show you because he actually had an uncle who was a gamekeeper in the Cumstoun estate in the late 1930s and early years of World War II. His uncle was a character called Adam McCrone Young, who has been a gamekeeper in the estate for many, many years. He had a wife, Mary Clark, and 2 daughters, Jean and Nettie. I believe he was killed in a road accident in the 1980s. I couldn't verify that. But what Archie remembers is his Uncle Adam teaching him how to fish and shoot by going around the estates at Cumstoun where he worked as a gamekeeper. He also specifically recalls that on occasion, Mrs. Maitland would, and I quote, phone him up at short notice explaining that she had guests coming over for a meal and could Adam nip out and catch a salmon or 2 for the table. Also at that time, she was a widow. Well, most of the men were away in war duty. So her uncle, as well as his gamekeeping duties, would often have to help around the house. And he does say that Mrs. Maitland was very appreciative of this. There's another slightly different range of first-hand accounts from this lady here. This is a Sarah Maitland, who spent a portion of her childhood growing up in Galloway. She wrote an introduction to a book called Very Heaven, which was an account of basically growing up in the 70s. And she remembers her mum, who was the formidable Hope Maitland, being a fairly typical mother, perhaps. She was very angrily snapping off the TV while the animals were singing House of the Rising Sun, as she felt Eric Burdon sweating was obscene. Additionally, Sarah was quite a rebellious teenager in the late 1960s. She was discovering feminism, so 1960s causes, human rights, etc., civil rights. And she was very reluctantly dragged off to, we saw people going to county balls. Well, the county balls were still on the go in the 1960s and 70s, although they were becoming slightly less popular. But Sarah can recall being dragged to a country ball with her dress made by a, quote, a travelling dressmaker, brackets, Polish and into yoga, stayed at our house and sewed my very pretty pale blue silk coming out dress, which I wore with a white tartan sash and my dread grandmother's pearls. And she obviously hated every minute of it. She went on to become a very successful writer in a whole number of genres, a ferociously intelligent lady. Her first novel, Daughter of Jerusalem, was published in 1978 and won the Somerset Maugham Award. This was an award for young writers. Now, when you consider that previous winners of this award had included such stellar figures as Ian McEwan and Martin Amis, it just gives you a sense of how good a writer of fiction she was. But she also wrote a whole lot of stuff, non-fiction material, religion, spirituality, fairy tales and myths, spirituality, and a very good book on solitude, actually, which is quite an interesting book. She was also a very successful columnist in a more sort of everyday type genre as a columnist for the Countryfile magazine, which was based, of course, on the highly successful TV programme. She wrote a very interesting columns talking about a whole range of contemporary issues for farmers and the farming community, and they're all very good and worth having a look at. While at Oxford, she had become friendly with a character, I don't know if any of you can recognise that. That is Bill Clinton, who actually visited Cumstoun House in 1973, and I think that is recorded somewhere in the visitors' books. So in conclusion, I think we can safely say, at least I hope we can safely say, that Cumstoun is a place of significant architectural importance and with a long and hopefully interesting history. Now this short talk, well, maybe not so short, it has only sort of really scratched the surface of this, and I feel there's much more research which could be done in a whole range of areas. For example, you could sort of develop the family photo albums and other archival material. I think you could do some stuff on the history of the furnishings and the fabrics to establish if any sort of the stuff was built or supplied by local tradesmen. You could do more oral history interviews to talk to people who had actually worked in the house or the gardens or in the estates and record their memories. I think also it's quite important as well as looking at the past, further examination of the past is important, but it's also important to consider that the future, especially as we've seen many of Scotland's wonderful country homes, including a number in Galloway, have been lost forever. And I do feel that would be a sad thing if that carried on. So in this context, I'm going to end by quoting the present incumbent Thomas, who's outlined his thoughts on the future of Cumstoun. So I'll just quote directly here. Houses like Cumstoun need care, time and money, but most of all, they need lived in. As important and interesting as the history of the building and the family that built it is, I don't want the house to be a museum. I want to see it full of people, family and friends, and guests who will all play their part in ensuring the future of the house while creating their own memories. As such, we're shortly starting on renovations, which will mean the house will be more suitable for modern living while maintaining the essential character that makes Cumstoun what it is. History, but with an extra bathroom or two, and weather largely on the outside. As part of this, we'll also be looking to make the house suitable for accommodation for around 20 guests to tie in with developments elsewhere in the estate. These include plans for events both inside and in the gardens with the house as backdrop, as well as exploring the potential of other buildings like the stables and walled garden. A lot has changed since Cumstoun was built, and serious consideration needs to be given to the role the house and estate can play in the local community through enhanced access and opportunities. I am privileged to be the most recent Maitland to call it home, and I want to ensure that the house has a long, sustainable future while sharing some of the joy that it has brought me and my family over nearly 200 years. Well, hopefully this will happen in another 200 years, the house at Cumstoun will still be occupied by the harum-scarum devils. Thanks very much for listening.